Welcome to the Breaking News Show by eTurbo News. For more episodes, go to breakingnewsshow.com. Stay tuned for the latest. 25% of Americans not ready for fast approaching Real ID deadline. Getting a Real ID is one thing that would be essential for all of this year's travel plans to come true. As we enter 2025, travel continues to be a significant focus for Americans. Recent surveys indicate that 92% of U.S. residents intends to travel, whether by land or air, this year. Furthermore, over half of Americans plan to travel more frequently than they did in 2024, with many prioritizing travel in their financial planning and budgeting efforts. And getting a Real ID is one thing that would be essential for all of this year's travel plans to come true. The Real ID Act of 2005, implemented following a recommendation from the 9/11 Commission, set forth minimum security requirements for state-issued driver's licenses and identification cards that federal agencies may recognize for activities such as boarding commercial aircraft regulated by the federal government, accessing specific federal facilities, and entering nuclear power plants. The enforcement of the Real ID Act and its associated regulations strengthens the security of these identification documents and improves the capacity of federal agencies to accurately confirm an individual's identity. Congress passed the Real ID Act in 2005 to enhance security standards for identification, directly in response to the security vulnerabilities highlighted by the 9/11 attacks, said former TSA Administrator David Peacock. Identity verification is foundational to security. I urge those who use a driver's license or state-issued identity card as their primary form of identification to access federal facilities or board commercial passenger aircraft, to ensure these credentials are Real ID compliant. We are committed to engaging with the public, licensing jurisdictions, and states to facilitate a smooth transition to Real ID enforcement beginning May 7, 2025, which this rule supports. The final deadline for a Real ID is swiftly approaching and the clock is ticking for those Americans who haven't obtained one yet. If you intend to travel by air on or after May 7, 2025, it is essential to obtain your Real ID. After this date, a standard driver's license will no longer suffice for the flights within the United States. Currently, 24% of Americans report not having a Real ID, and among them, 64% do not know what it is or do not plan to get one before the May 7 deadline. Last month, the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, has announced the publication of a final rule that establishes a framework for the gradual enforcement of Real ID requirements by federal agencies. Starting on May 7, 2025, residents of all U.S. states and territories will be required to present a Real ID compliant license or identification, or an alternative form of acceptable identification, in order to access federal facilities, enter nuclear power plants, and board commercial aircraft. Basically, Real ID is an upgraded form of the conventional state driver's license or state identification card, with extra features added to assist authorities in combating terrorism and identity theft. According to the Department of Homeland Security, all 50 states and the District of Columbia are currently in compliance with federal Real ID standards. Starting on May 7, 2025, Transportation Security Administration personnel stationed at the ticket document verification area in airports will prevent travelers from accessing the checkpoint without a Real ID compliant license or an alternative form of acceptable identification after May 7, 2025. Acceptable alternative forms of identification include a valid passport, a federal government PIV card, or a U.S. military identification card. Children under the age of 18 are not mandated by the TSA to present identification when traveling domestically within the United States. For inquiries related to specific identification requirements for minors, it is advisable to reach out to the airline directly. Thank you for listening. Watch and listen to more episodes on breakingnewsshow.com.